Okay, good afternoon. I'm Asher Cohn of the Ajam Media Collective, and I'm sitting here with Mishana Garschi and Sohail Daulatzai, who's professor of film, media, and African American studies and author of Black Star, Crescent Moon, which we're going to discuss the first couple chapters of today. Um, so, if you two want to say hello, say how you're doing today.
Hi, everybody. Thanks to Asher and Bita and Mishana for making this happen. Should be fun.
So I just wanted to start before we even really get into the questions. We want to talk about the book. We just talk about how you really got started on this topic, tracing Black radicalism to Islam, Islam's influences, and a lot more things than it's usually thought of, especially in 20th century thought. We wanted,
Yeah, I mean, I
uh,
think for me, I mean, yeah. No, go ahead. I mean, for me, I think if we talk about like why the book, or you know, in many ways, it was kind of, I mean, it wasn't autobiographical per se, but it was kind of me telling, a lot of the story of how I grew up and my own influences. In terms of how they were shaped. So I was deeply influenced by, coming to this country. I was born in Peshawar, and we moved to this country in the 70s. And, when it came, I came from a deeply political family back along the border, who were kind of resisting British colonialism and whatnot. And so coming to the States, that kind of continued here with my parents. And you know, uh, in many ways, my father kind of saw kind of immigrant Muslim communities and the mosque in many ways as too limiting as a place for like political organizing or consciousness raising. So we did most of that outside. And I remember growing up, and Muhammad Ali was like a huge figure in our house. My father was kind of an admirer of him when he was, back in Pakistan after what Ali did in the Vietnam War. And so Ali fights were really important to us. I remember when Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was like traded to the Lakers, and it wasn't up until like the early to mid '80s where hip hop started to kind of emerge, and Malcolm X becomes this kind of really seminal figure. And so for me, and it's really kind of um, telling in some ways that like Louis Farrakhan spoke to me more as a young person than anything I heard coming out of a mosque or an immigrant Muslim community. And of course, he's speaking to his particular experience around blackness, but I think the way in which he understood or talked about white supremacy to me resonated more with me and my experiences. Not to go into too much detail, but growing up around the Iran hostage crisis in the U.S. wasn't like the most welcoming thing for me, and it really shaped me kind of politically as a young person in my relationship to this thing called America. So long story short, like I grew up, around kind of this kind of really, like socially aware kind of space where culture and politics were coming together. And it was, Ali, it was Malcolm, it was hip hop. I remember watching the Battle of Algiers as a young kid and being blown away. And that kind of like, led me into like kind of a whole intellectual and political like identity that ultimately became Black Star Crescent Moon. I mean, so in that sense, it's autobiographical. It's really kind of telling, in some ways, the things that I grew up with, and it was really surprising, but not like when I would do book tours and travel, and people who were my age would be like, "Wow, you told my story. Like this was the stuff that I grew up." That helped shape how I saw the world. And so it was just interesting to hear that, both here in the United States and across the pond, so to speak, like in Europe. Like it was amazing how many people had a similar experience, and how central blackness and black radicalism and Islam were to kind of people's political identities.
it's really interesting.
So, I mean, I think that's, and again, just to tell more backstory on the book, like it wasn't it wasn't my dissertation. My dissertation was a very different, not very different, but it was only like a chapter and a half of this book. I wrote this book really kind of, in many ways, my dissertation was something I had to just get done to finish grad school, and I really wanted to after 9/11. I really only pulled a chapter out of it and really wanted to tell that story because I felt after 9/11, those ideas weren't getting out. Like, people weren't dealing with the history of blackness and Islam, and particularly black radicalism and Islam. You know, it was too much of this immigrant narrative that was, as I'm sure we'll get into, really about kind of honorary whiteness and acceptability politics and respectability politics. And it was kind of erasing this deeper history, I felt.
So going off of that, I was wondering if for our audience and ourselves, if we can break it down and get some basic definitions of how exactly you're defining black, because you talk about how Malcolm defines black. And I was wondering, is it a political position, or is it about not being white? How are you defining Muslim? I think if we just like define these terms early on, it'll help our discussion.
Sure, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think in the book, like, I tried to lay out, you know, Malcolm and the Nation of Islam during his time there, and even afterwards, he would say, you know, if you're not white, you're black, right? And there's a whole politics to that. I mean, in terms of how the Nation of Islam, they understood what blackness meant. It meant something in a particular moment. And again, we're talking about this era of, you know, decolonization. So we're talking about black liberation struggles here in the U.S., but we're also talking about it in relationship to, like, decolonization in the third world. I mean, we have to remember, and it's hard for us to kind of look back now and think about how throughout Africa, throughout Asia, and what we now refer to as the Middle East, of course, is West Asia, you know, and in different parts of Latin America, like, the global south, or the third world, was on fire. So we have to understand, like, they were rebelling against European control and U.S. imperialism. So Malcolm's and the Nation of Islam's use of the term black at that time was kind of really specific to a particular historical moment, right, where it was about white supremacy. And so I think I tried to kind of convey that there's a different way in which blackness was being conceived. And what does that mean for us today when we think about blackness? Can we talk about political blackness versus, and again, not to get too heady, what's referred to as ontological blackness? That is to say, you can be politically black and be down with black social movements and black radical social movements, but you're not visibly black. You know, you're not, you know, through your skin tone and skin color and a whole host of other markers, black. So that means something different. So I think it's important for us to tease out those differences. I think blackness, we have to be very careful about what we mean when we talk about that today. As far as Muslim, for me, you know, when I think about Muslim, I'm talking about a kind of racial category in some ways. You know, I'm talking about, of course, those who come from so-called Muslim majority countries, right? So Egypt, Pakistan, you know, Syria, Palestine, whatever the case may be. I mean, those are Muslims, and those are Muslim diasporas. Of course, we don't think about, and again, this is part of the reason why I wanted to get at it in this book, was to extend a conversation that people were already having, but I wanted to kind of talk about it in a different ways. When we say black, we don't think Muslim, because we don't think about black Muslims, when in fact they're the largest group of Muslims in the United States, right? So for me, when we talk about Muslim, I wanted to talk about a more expansive category, because, you know, here in Los Angeles, you know, this is like the capital of the Iranian diaspora. Now, when you talk to most Iranians in LA, like, they're going to have a kind of really complicated relationship to this thing called Islam, or being called Muslim. Now, that's their prerogative, and that might be how they understand themselves, and that might be their own relationship to it based on the history of what happened in '79, and et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't mean that when they travel through an airport, or someone asks them where they're from and how the state kind of marks them, that they're not seen as Muslim. So to me, however you identify, that's one thing. You could be a 5-time praying believer. You could be like the most devout person. Or you could be, as I know in many cases, some people who come from Muslim majority countries who are outright atheists, but their name is Ali, or their name is Muhammad, or their name is whatever the case may be, and the state still sees them as a Muslim, right? So to me, Muslim has become a way of defining a kind of racial other right now, and that's what I kind of wanted to also get at through this idea of the Muslim International. It's a kind of category that talks about racial otherness, but it does have some geographic specificity, but not completely. And maybe I'm sure we can kind of talk about that a little bit more. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, no, that was great. I guess so similar to the term Muslim, it's also about like a political position as long as being like a category in which you get racialized by.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, it is a political position. You know, and I've had these conversations. I mean, if you talk about, for example, when we talk about Zionism in Palestine, for example, right? Most people don't think about the significant number of Palestinians that are Christians. They just think Palestinians are Muslims, right? All Arabs are Muslim, right? And to some even more ignorant people, all Muslims are Arabs, right? So I think like in those places, like it's important for us to think about how the idea of Muslimness or the racial category of Muslimness or the fear of Muslim is mapped onto people who aren't necessarily Muslim, Palestinian Christians. I mean, we know after 9/11, I mean, Sikhs were attacked and even killed because people thought they were Muslim, right? So there's a way in which being Muslim has become this kind of fluid category in some ways that includes people who are maybe born but no longer practice, but includes people who absolutely are not. Sikhs, Palestinian Christians, even Hindus, right? A whole bunch of other groups of people. So to me, Muslim has become a kind of racial marker, right? And so it can be a political position in the same way that when Malcolm was talking about political blackness at a previous point in history, Muslim can become a political position. And you're seeing that being taken up today, where certain groups and organizing social movements are kind of using that framework to kind of like express their politics.
So following that, do you think you could explain for us or go into more detail about the term Muslim International? Because I know that that's like the basis of your argument in the book.
Right.
And just for us to have a little more clarity on the definition.
Sure. So for me, I mean, a couple things. I mean, you know, within Islam, you know, there's this notion of, well, I wanted to distinguish it from like an Islamic international, right? And again, because Islam is a set of ideas, Muslims are the people who try to aspire to them. It's the materiality. They live in the real world. Muslims live in the real world. Islam is a set of ideas. So I wanted to make a distinction between Islam and Muslims, right? Because I really want to center kind of structures and forces that are in the real world that people who call themselves Muslim or whatnot have to live under. But even within that, there's this notion within Islam about the ummah, right? This kind of transnational, kind of global sense of belonging that the community believes in. There's a global sense of community called the ummah. And it's this kind of utopian space, right? It kind of operates much like when people think about a diaspora, like if you think about the African diaspora, it's this kind of idea or set of ideas that people kind of seek a belonging to. And the ummah for Muslims somewhat taps into that. But I wanted to resist that because in many ways the ummah is somewhat of a transcendent idea. That is to say it exists across time. It's something that is constant, it's always around, regardless of the time period it exists. And so for me, I wanted to talk about the Muslim International. Now, I was shifting from Islamic to Muslim, and I was borrowing from the tradition of kind of first, second, and third internationals coming out of Marxist history, right? Because I was really interested in telling the story, or trying to tell the story, of a kind of transnational set of networks through art, through politics, that Muslims or those in solidarity with Muslims were seeking to shape and give like voice to, right? So to me, Muslim International became a kind of global space. But again, it's not something that's transcendent. It's actually shaped by the world, right? It's by the social struggles, by the political struggles that are taking place. And that's how the Muslim International. So what I like to say is the Muslim International isn't about being, it's about becoming, right? It's a constant thing that's being shaped at different particular moments in time based on social, political, economic forces that are in the world, right? So, how the Muslim International looked during Malcolm's time will be different than how it looks today, right? And so it's this really kind of like fluid space. On the one hand, it is an idea, and it might be a utopian idea, but on the other hand, it is something real and material when you start to look at the kind of networks and ways that solidarity is happening, right? So I don't know if that helps answer that question a little bit. I'm sure as we talk more specifically about examples, I can kind of, I'll touch back on, well, this is an example of what I'm talking about with the Muslim International, right?
Definitely. We actually have our first Twitter question, which is pretty exciting. But it goes in really well with Mishana's previous question with your explanation, where there's concepts. I think in popular understanding, there's an understanding of blackness as a race, of Muslimness as a race. But it seems what you're doing is trying to give groups a typology without reifying race. Does that sound accurate with what you're trying to say?
Without reifying?
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Asher. Go ahead.
I would say, how can we, discuss these issues of race without reifying the concept of race, of kind of forcing people into a racial identity?
Right. I mean, I think this has always been the kind of difficulty, right? Like, on the one hand, when we talk about race, we're talking about a language, but also a system of control that's been used historically, right? And of course, this is part of what I was trying to get at too. Like, if we talk about the modern concept of race, like how it emerged, what it emerged out of, and I talk about this in the introduction. And many people have done this work, the modern conception of race, particularly its relationship to the nation state, like how race and nation state got linked was through the figure of the Moor, right? The black and the Muslim, right? I mean, we think about 1492 and this moment that we all learned in school, this kind of nursery rhyme about Columbus sailing the ocean blue. Well, that same year that Columbus supposedly discovers the New World, right, is at the same time that the Moors are expelled from Europe, right? So Europe defines itself against the Moor, against the Muslim and the black, right? And in fact, when it comes to the so-called New World, this is how it understands the indigenous people here as Moors. If you read those early documents, and many scholars have done this work, they're reading them and understanding them as Musulman. They don't have any other way of understanding these people other than their otherness, because to them others were Muslims and these are others too, so we're going to call them Muslims as well. So what I'm suggesting is Muslim became a way of and Edward Said's Orientalism really gets at that, right? Like, the Muslim becomes this kind of, in some ways, quintessential other to the West. Now, fast forward to different points in time, whenever we're talking about race, the question always becomes, well, how do we challenge race without, as you mentioned, Asher, or the Twitter question got it, how do we do that without reifying race, right? Like, that's a good question, because it's impossible to challenge racism or white supremacy without using the language of race, right? And I think we all know that we're all, as we all like to claim at different points, we're all just human beings. We are individuals. We have a humanity, right? Now, that doesn't mean that the world sees us that way, right? So we all want to be just seen as individuals. We all want to just be seen as human beings. But when the rubber hits the road of white supremacy, right, now we have to deal with the language of race in order to challenge that. So it's a conundrum. The very thing that has subjected us, right, our skin color, our, where we're from, those kinds of markers that determine who we are relative to dominant cultures or whiteness become the very thing that we use to fight whiteness, right? So that's what I talk about in the book around Malcolm and Blackness, right? So Malcolm valorized blackness. They saw blackness as something that was beautiful. It was a way of challenging white supremacy, because white supremacy saw blackness as degraded. So I think it's an inescapable part of modernity that we are trapped within the language of race because race is so prevalent and pervasive. It's inescapable. So I think that it's very difficult. We can't fight white supremacy by just simply saying, oh, I'm a human being and I'm an individual, because white supremacy doesn't see you as such.
Thank you.
So following that line of thinking, like, I tend to equate white supremacy with the West. And I'm just wondering what's the relationship between like the Muslim International and white supremacy and the West? Like, are they completely opposite from each other, or how do they interact? Like, is one defined as not being the other?
Sure. I mean, we hear about it all the time, right? The West, and on the one hand, it suggests geography, like okay, Europe and the United States, right? And then there's a history to this, like the West and the non-West, or the West and the rest, right? And there's a certain kind of geographical distinction that's made. But I think what's more powerful and more enduring about this idea of the West is the ideas that it embodies, right? The West is really a placeholder, right? It presumes that the West is about rationality, about being progressive, about democracy, about civilization. It has all these kind of affirming ideas of itself, even though the very foundation of the West was built on genocide and slavery, right? Like it doesn't want to deal with that side, right? So the West is a set of ideas more than it is geography. And again, the West's ideas have spread through the nation state, through how it defines democracy, through the role of the United Nations, a whole host of ways in which the ideas of the West have spread. So for me, when I talked about the Muslim International, it can exist within the West, but it's about challenging the fundamental precepts of the West. So it's about challenging patriarchy. It's about challenging white supremacy. It's about challenging capitalism, right? So in that sense, to me, the West and the Muslim International are opposed to each other. The Muslim International is seeking to challenge and undo what the havoc that the West has wreaked on the world, right?
This is really interesting to me. Something that it's taken me a bit of time to wrap my head around in the book is how there's no geography as I'm used to understanding it in the book. When we're talking about the West, this is what I found fascinating. Is we're talking about the Bandung Conference, we're talking about Algiers, but the only real reference in the first couple chapters to Muslim communities in Europe is the Paris Massacre of 1961. But it's something that's interesting to me how there are, Muslim communities in Europe are huge centers of Muslim thought, of anti-colonialist thought, of internationalist thought. And I guess how do you see those? Yeah, where do those communities fit into this internationalist presence? These kind of post-colonial communities in Paris, in Rotterdam, in Brussels. In Teju Cole's Open City, there's this whole fantastic anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist discussion happens in Brussels between Nigerian and Moroccan. Where do these sort of things fit into just kind of setup that you just discussed?
Yeah, that's a great question, Asher. I mean, I think it's a central part of it. I mean, in the book, obviously, I was kind of trying to locate different versions of the Muslim International within the U.S., right? Like, how do we understand this idea of the Muslim International within Black radical art and Black radical politics? And clearly there were connections. I mean, Malcolm travels and does, of course, his famous speech in Oxford. Malcolm goes and tries to get into Paris and is rejected. Malcolm is in Switzerland and traveling and meeting with different Muslim leaders. And Malcolm is, and there's even a history, of course, and I quote, at different points, like even Baldwin, when he's spending time in Paris, Baldwin is coming into contact with the Algerians, and he's, unlike many Black writers who sought to, and jazz musicians who sought to escape, U.S. white supremacy, who went to Paris, they went there as a place of refuge and were given visas, and many of them, in order to maintain their visas, were relatively silent on French racism and colonialism toward the Algerians. And this is going on at the 50s and the 60s when anti-colonialism in Algeria is at an all-time high. But Baldwin refuses to speak, or to be silent on it. Baldwin comes out and is vocal about his criticisms about the French and the Algerians. And there's a novel, William Gardner Smith, that I mentioned called The Stone Face, which is an incredible novel about this Black writer who goes to Paris and hangs out with the Algerians and is there for that 1961 Papon massacre, that he all of a sudden sees then the Algerians as having a common destiny with Black people in the United States against white supremacy. So I tried to touch on it, but again, you're absolutely right. Like the book for me, Black Star Crescent Moon was about U.S.-based Black radical movements. But absolutely, I think that what's taking place, as Teju gets at beautifully, in London, in Paris, of course, in Berlin, with Turkish diasporas, like, you know, Europe is a vast, I think, reservoir of thinking about the Muslim International. I mean, I think there's a tremendous amount, as far as I'm concerned, of history there, and also right now, like contemporary struggles that I think would fit very nicely into this kind of framework that I've put into place.
So we've kind of started talking about Black radicalism now, and
Right.
in the first chapter of your book, you like kind of compare the civil rights movement to like Black radicalism, like SNCC and like the Panthers and stuff. So I was just, you know, you talk about how people in the civil rights movement like were like down with American imperialism and okay with the efforts going abroad. And I was wondering how you see like Black Americans benefit from U.S. empire, but also being a victim of white supremacy and U.S. empire still, if that
Right.
makes sense.
Sure. No, I mean, I think this is part of what I was trying to get at. I mean, it you know, in terms of like some of the foundational ideas in the book, because I mean, for me, even post 9/11, you know, I'm going to answer your question this way. For me, post 9/11, the question was, wow, like, how are non-white communities aligning themselves so enthusiastically with U.S. empire? Like, what is this about, right? Like, Black communities, different kinds of brown Latino communities, South Asian community. I mean, what was this about, right? And so this is when I really wanted to kind of like historicize this a little bit and say, you know what, what is this new imperial multiculturalism? How is it that all this kind of, you know, this multicultural fabric of people are aligning themselves with U.S. empire? And for me, it was like, okay, well then that's because this is about color blindness and the post-racial. So people aren't talking about race. But where does this idea of the post-racial come from? It comes from the civil rights movement. Right? This is an outgrowth of what we call civil rights. So civil rights is what got us to the point in the 80s and 90s where we were like not to talk about race. It was color blindness. It was the post-racial. It in fact even got Obama elected, right? Like civil rights is seen as this paradigmatic moment in American history. And I was like, well, what was civil rights? Let's go back and talk about that. I mean, the country celebrates Dr. King. What was civil rights? So I started to do more reading, and I found some incredible scholarship. Penny von Eschen and, you know, Brenda Plummer and a whole host of other scholars who were doing this work and looking at how civil rights emerged. And so as I talk about in the book, you know, after World War II, there was a huge kind of upsurge of Black radical and Black left politics that saw Black people in relationship to the anti-colonial struggles taking place in Africa and Asia and parts of Latin America. They're like, yes, but and they saw their struggles in the United States, you know, as tied to those struggles, right? And so, long story short, I think I detail it in the book, but my point was that, like, out of this Black radical, Black left politics that was shaping, there was a break, a fracture, and the Cold War really did that work. It broke apart this coalition of Black leftist and Black radical kind of social movements, and they saw and they aligned themselves with anti-communist foreign policy, right? The Cold War was like, communism is public enemy number one. It's the biggest threat to the post-war security that was so hard fought and gained. And in order to maintain like what we achieved in World War II, this is what the U.S. is saying through the Truman Doctrine, we have to fight communism. That's the new scourge, right? And so we have to fight communism at home, domestically, through the Red Scare, and we have to fight it abroad. So the Truman Doctrine said that anywhere that communism raises its head, the U.S. can go in and just infiltrate, can invade, can subvert, can arm covertly or overtly to destroy communism. And we've seen, you know, Mossadegh in Iran in '52 is the first casualty. But the Korean War just before that starts because of the anti-communist, you know, scare. Arbenz in Guatemala is overthrown in 54. Patrice Lumumba is assassinated by the CIA in 1959. And those are just the ones that we know about, right? But anti-communism becomes the thing that defines America. So civil rights emerges out of this moment. Now, I think, and I hope in the book it's clear that what ended up happening was these black organizations and these social movements, they were facing tremendous violence domestically, right? I mean, there was still segregation on the books, segregation in transportation, education, housing, you know, etc. Lynching was still a national sport. And so what they said was, and you know, I talk about Truman's Commission on Race and Civil Rights, they said, okay, you know, because America didn't want to, in order to gain favor in the third world, America didn't want to seem like they were like Europe, like old racists. So the third world, though, was seeing the treatment of black people all over the news media, in its own press, like, oh, black people are being lynched. America still has segregation. So you're not any different than Europe, America. You're the same thing. Why should we trust you? So America had to rebrand itself. And it had to kind of appropriate blackness to kind of make itself seem like it was more progressive. And I talk about this. I mean, this was a very explicit policy based on the U.S. on the State Department. And so, anyway, what ends up happening is the major civil rights organizations decide, okay, we will support your anti-communist foreign policy. We will support the Cold War in Africa, ironically, right, and in Asia. But in exchange for that, we want you to pass an anti-lynching law. We want you to desegregate housing, transportation, and education, right? There was a kind of a quid pro quo. So I don't want to suggest that, like, the civil rights movement, as we now know it, sold out, right, and just kind of like capitulated to U.S. empire, right? They were making a very kind of difficult calculation. As I like to often say, don't hate the player, you got to hate the game, right? Like, the game was rigged, right? And they had to make a calculation. How do we kind of find some sort of space where we can, you know, stop the kind of onslaught that we're facing? If we need to align ourselves with the Cold War in order to get some laws passed, then so be it, right? And this is ultimately what they did. So you started to then see black leaders, artists, activists, even early Dr. King align themselves with the Cold War and anti-communist U.S. intervention abroad. And of course, Malcolm and Robeson and Claudia Jones and a whole host of other black radicals resisted that. They took a different route, and they paid for it, right? Du Bois and Robeson have their passports stripped. Claudia Jones is deported. Malcolm is assassinated. But there was a split, and I tried to get at what it meant for, you know, these black radicals like Malcolm to align themselves with a larger struggle against white supremacy around the world, as opposed to the position the civil rights movement took, which was, okay, out of kind of pragmatic politics, we're going to align ourselves with Cold War U.S. foreign policy, and we're going to try to extract some concessions from the state by passage of these laws, and in so doing, give black people some kind of a respite from, you know, white supremacy and state violence here in the U.S. I don't know. I hope that helps understand kind of a bit of the climate, you know?
Yeah, no, it totally helps.
That was great. Something really, again, throughout this book, it's really fascinating for me, you know, as a lay reader, as a non-academic, to read about everything that's going on at this time, and kind of, you know, reading in undergraduate history class, you're like, oh, you know, black rights was a thing that was tried but didn't work out, and that's kind of like the sentence you get, and then we move on to the 1970s sort of thing. So really, like, getting the feeling of what's going on at international level is incredible. And one of my favorite things, and move on to chapter 2, is Baghdad Blues, the Greenwood book. It was really interesting, you know, I guess worked abroad and seeing, like, U.S. State Department can sometimes be very wary of non-white people working for the U.S. State Department at times. And, you know, I'm almost reading that passage you had in the book through their eyes. They're like, oh, this is why we don't trust passing non-whites, because this sort of thing might happen. It's kind of interesting seeing that. And along those lines, you know, tie back to the forward where you said that Blackness is now the face of empire with Obama's presidency. But comparing that to when you talk about Baghdad Blues, where the protagonist is seen as not quite the face of American empire in Baghdad in that novel. So how much is Blackness, in Greenlee's mind, I think Blackness with Obama would be the face of empire or only a face of empire? How much?
No, yeah, it's a great question, Ash. I mean, and it gets at like so many issues. I mean, it gets at what Mishana's previous question was trying to get at was like, how did the U.S. use Blackness to further its agenda, right? I mean, so during the Civil Rights Movement, and this is what Baghdad Blues is dealing with, and it situates itself right in the Cold War, in Cold War Iraq, right? And here's this black man, Dave Burrell, who goes to Baghdad in the service of the U.S. State Department, right? And he's seen as having kind of representational potential, as it's called. Like he's going to represent the best of black people, and also show the U.S. to be this like kind of progressive place where black people can serve, U.S. democracy. Because again, Blackness is this constant thing that is seen to redeem America. If America can somehow celebrate Blackness, then it's seen as overcoming slavery. It's somehow gotten past it now, right? It's a redemptive kind of thing to always hold Blackness up and say, see, we love black people too, right? I mean, and of course that overlooks, tremendous violence that continues to happen, but the representational potential is really important. And I want to just like quote a few pieces. Like this is like the kind of thinking that was being taking place. So for example, I'm quoting from page 13 in the book, and this is taking place in during the Cold War. So Adam Clayton Powell, who's just an kind of historic figure, right? He said, quote, this is Powell talking about the relationship of Blackness to U.S. empire. Quote, one dark face from the U.S. is as much value as millions of dollars in economic aid to the third world, right? Ralph Bunche, another historic figure, right? He said that in order to win over Africa and Asia, the legend of America as a liberalizing force in world affairs could be established if carefully chosen Negroes could prove more effective than whites, owing to their unique ability to gain more readily the confidence of the native, right? So here you have these landmark black leaders talking about making a case to the U.S. government. Hey, put us in these positions abroad because we will do great work for you. Our face, our image as black people will cultivate a sense of trust with these other non-white peoples who are deeply skeptical of white supremacy. They've been dealing with Europe for so long, you have to position yourself as different. And so I think that was what was so brilliant about Greenlee's Baghdad Blues was he was getting at those contradictions. And, knowing Sam, and, tragically we lost him last year, but knowing Sam and spending time with him and learning more about that history, as you can read it, if you've read the novel, Burrell doesn't align himself with the U.S. national project. In fact, he sees himself as having more in common with the Iraqis. And I think that was really interesting to me, that kind of tension, right, where he saw more solidarity with the Iraqis than he did with the U.S. Now, the last part of your question, Asher, about is Blackness a face of American empire or the face of American empire? Absolutely, it's not the only face, right? It's not the only face. But when we say Blackness and empire, in the case of Obama, there's a particular kind of legitimacy that the American national project gets when Blackness is its face or one of its faces. And obviously the president is the biggest face, right? And clearly we know that the president is, he's the king, but there's also the throne, right? There's many kings, but the throne is where power really lies, right? And so Obama is really the face of the empire right now, but that's not something new. And I talked about it in the book. So Penny Von Eschen's work on the jazz tours in the 1950s and 60s. So the State Department funded these, jazz tours. They were called the jazz ambassadors. They paid for all these incredible jazz musicians to go around the third world and show that the United States loved black art, right? And we also come to find out that even Richard Wright's presence at the Bandung Conference for his book The Color Curtain was was funded by the CIA. Wright didn't know it at the time, but the CIA was funding all these kinds of like black artists and activists to travel and do the work of U.S. empire. So I think it's always important, and we should always be cautious of how race is used when we talk about American empire, because today there's a tremendous amount of interest in getting Muslims, right, to be the face of U.S. empire. So, for example, the Voice of America, for example, is a kind of classic space in which this is happening. But the State Department is constantly trying to use the face of Muslims in a post 9/11 context and say, hey, look to the Muslim world. We have Muslims here in America who are down with America. They love being here, and they're able to succeed and be, full human beings. So you should trust us too. So it's not only about blackness and U.S. empire that should cause us to be skeptical. It's about how other kinds of identities are aligned with empire that we should be skeptical of.
Definitely. Kind of leads into, we have another question from Twitter that we wanted to get to, which was about Palestine and civil rights, which is incredibly broad. But I think the idea was that obviously a lot of stuff yesterday was 50th anniversary of Selma, Bloody Sunday. And now there's definitely, a push from a lot of ways to frame the Palestinian struggle in terms of civil rights. Kind of, if you follow these steps from the 50s and 60s, you'll be able to get to where you want to be. There's obviously a pushback about that. And the question from Twitter was, what would decolonial internationalist discourse look like today in this, in the Palestinian framework, in this very different domestic international framework, referring to, I think, Bandung in Algiers from the 50s and 60s.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the great things about the Palestinian solidarity stuff is the way in which Palestine has in many ways become the symbol of kind of international solidarity, right? I mean, so you see it across the board, right? From the BDS movements here in the U.S., I mean, all the stuff that was going on around Ferguson and Gaza, where the young people in Gaza were taking photos and showing people in Ferguson how to deal with tear gas, right? This is how you deal with tear gas. And in Ferguson, a lot of the youth there, I know a lot of my friends who were on the ground there, people were deeply inspired by that. So Palestine has become that symbol. It's become in many ways the de facto Bandung, this kind of symbolic kind of space that people have gathered around, right, to try and Bandung wasn't a perfect place. I mean, I don't want to argue, I don't want to suggest that Bandung was this utopian idea, because there's all kinds of complexities in it. But so too with Palestine, there's all these kinds of things that we have to be aware of. But I think Palestine has become that symbol of kind of international solidarity. But we're living in a very different era, as you mentioned, Asher. I mean, what does it mean now? And a lot of comparisons are made to South Africa with Palestine, and I think a lot of them are appropriate, and maybe some aren't. But I think one thing that we have to be aware of is, what happened to South Africa in order for quote unquote apartheid to end. And I put that in quotes. And what does it mean for in the era of neoliberalism and global capital to argue for a nation state, right? Because if we look around the world, right, in many ways the nation state has become a prison for some, right? And what would it mean for Palestine? I mean, again, there's a whole host of questions, how do we create a contiguous nation state out of the West Bank? I mean, that's a fundamental question. I mean, the only thing contiguous in Palestine right now is Gaza, and I don't even know what to call that, other than an open-air death camp, right? But if we have a nation state that's Palestinian, how is it going to work, right? What kind of control is the U.S. and Israel and global capital going to have on that nation state, right? Is it just going to be another site and source of cheap labor, right? So what kind of sovereignty does it really have? So there's a way in which I think the lessons of Bandung and decolonization we have to learn from, because it was one thing to be granted independence, and Edward Said would make this distinction, but it was another thing to have freedom, right? So we have, in Zimbabwe and in India and in other places, the British flag came down and the Egyptian or Indian or Zimbabwean flag went up. But what did we really do? We replaced one form of control with another, right? And so the idea of the nation state, I think, is something that we have to be a little bit more skeptical of when it comes to particularly a place like Palestine. I think those kinds of questions, I still think, to me, remain unanswered. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try and end Zionism. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that what are we asking for to replace Zionism, right?
So we have two questions left. I'm going to ask one, Mishana's going to ask the other, so we can get everyone out of here in time to enjoy the afternoon. But it was brought to my attention that you're a film media studies professor. We haven't asked you any film studies questions yet, so we should probably change that. And the main question I had, chapter 2, you talk about Battle of Algiers a lot, and something that it might be a little bit film studies 101, but how much does the watcher's own baggage affect how they see a film? When I first saw Battle of Algiers, it was actually an undergraduate class on terrorism studies, learning how terrorism is done. And sort of thing, looking back, I think the professor was trying to be a little insidious and trying to make us question this a lot more than he would have otherwise been able to in a undergraduate course. But it's interesting. That's the lens through which I saw it. How much do different lenses give people different understandings of film as seminal, just as incredible as Battle of Algiers?
Right. I mean, I think, ironically, I wrote about it in chapter 2, but my next book project is on the Battle of Algiers, right? And absolutely, clearly people's baggage, for lack of a better word, their own perceptions, their own ideas inform how they see something, right? So they can make meaning out of things differently, right? There's not, but I think the Battle of Algiers is really important because, and it's ironic, Asher. It's not ironic, though, but it's not accidental. Like you said, that you saw the film in a terrorism studies course. Can I ask you what year that was?
You're going to date me. You look old. I think it was 2008 or so.
Oh, wow. 2008 is old, huh? Okay. 7 years ago. You were an undergrad then. All right. That's not coincidental, right? And this is what I'm talking about in my book, right? So the Battle of Algiers, I see that when I show it to my students, right? It's a very different film now after 9/11 than it was before 9/11, right? Before 9/11, as I tried to get to in the book, the Algerian independence struggle, the work of Frantz Fanon, right, was Algiers in many ways became the capital of the Third World. Remember, the Black Panther Party's first international office is in Algiers. Right, Eldridge Cleaver emerges out of exile when he leaves Cuba in Algeria at the Pan-African Cultural Festival there. Right, Algiers was this kind of this kind of crossroads of revolutionaries all over the world, and it was because of Fanon. It was about also the Algerian independence struggle, but it was about the way in which the film The Battle of Algiers became this kind of way of broadcasting all these ideas in film form of how to resist, and how can a film give sympathy or empathy or dignity to people who are fighting back. For so long, film had been about the European perspective, the West's perspective in the Third World, and it was all about these exotic lands and these white people working out their anxieties out on the margins of the world, and there was no dignity to the people of the global South. But the Battle of Algiers gave it back in a very forceful way. And I talk about the different things that it tries to do, and I think it's such an incredible film. It's my favorite film of all time. But what ended up happening was the Pentagon in 2004 screens the film for its generals after the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. And there's a very, very famous kind of flyer that the Pentagon puts out in 2004, and it says something like, and I'm just paraphrasing, women planting bombs in cafe, explosions, taking place left and right. The indigenous population is unruly. The occupying army is unstable. Sound familiar, right? And of course, they're talking about Iraq and the U.S. occupation, but they say this happened before. Come watch a screening of the Battle of Algiers. Right? So the Battle of Algiers after 9/11 took on a whole other life of its own. And now it's being viewed, and again, for the Pentagon, the film was a training manual for how to do counterinsurgency, right? So it shifted the perspective. It was like, how do we watch this film to learn how to defeat the enemy? Whereas the Battle of Algiers as a film was made for a very different reason. It was made to say, how do we resist an occupying army, right? So the kind of whole thrust of the film was subverted, so that now when Asher is in a class in 2008, he's watching it in a class called terrorism studies, right? When I show it to my students, you know, many of them who were born just before 9/11 or a little bit earlier in the 90s but didn't know too much, to them 9/11 is a given. So they don't really question this kind of environment. And even kids who you think might, like, so it's important, like, when they see the film The Battle of Algiers now, they see it as a dangerous film. They see it as a film like, wait a minute, this is glorifying terrorism, right? This is like, and in some ways it legitimizes the war on terror rhetoric, right? So the film has been, I felt, subverted. It's the power of the film has been attempted to be taken away. But I think there's still enough people who watch the film today who see the value of it, you know? Of course, like as I mentioned before in the opening, like, I remember watching that film as like a 17-year-old kid and just blown away. Like, I didn't even know film could do this. You know what I mean? Like, the power that film could have to convey this kind of an idea just blew my mind. And I think it did for a lot of people. So it continues to be a landmark film, but as is many things, including the Selma March yesterday and all that, you know, power tries to rewrite history all the time. And I think the Battle of Algiers is a classic case in point of that.
So I guess this is our last question because we're running out of time. But following up with your like analysis on Battle of Algiers, in Black Star Crescent Moon, like, you're writing a lot about the intersection of Islam and Black radicalism and Black internationalism and the American Empire, and like, you know, it's very well researched, and you make it very clear how like the Muslim Third World and movements going on abroad have influenced Black radicalism here in the U.S. And, you know, like, I know it's in a later chapter, but just hip-hop and how much, like, the pillars of hip-hop are based on Islam, all these things that once you read about it become so obvious, but it's not a history that we intuitively know. Like, we're not taught this at all about the influence of Islam on these, like, things that we're taught about. And I know it's a hard question to answer, but, like, why do you think this is? Why do you think we don't know anything about it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons why. I mean, you know, Black Islam has been, I mean, Islam has been in the U.S. pre-Columbus.
Right.
But when we talk about Black Islam, I mean, it came here with Africans who were enslaved, right? You know, Sylvain Diouf and others have talked about, like, up to 30 to 40% of the Africans who were brought here and made slaves were Muslim, right? So it's got a deep history in this country. And in many ways it was, you know, Michael Gomez's book on the Black Crescent, he talks about different slave rebellions. The largest slave rebellion in the Western Hemisphere was by Muslims in Brazil, right? And the way in which Islam and Black Muslims were systematically eradicated because they were seen as too unruly, right? And in fact, there was moments where the British and the Spanish, like, banned the importation of Muslim slaves, right? Because they just felt like it was too much trouble. So there's a really submerged history, and I just think that, like, there's a lot of reasons for it. One, as I tried to get at in the book, I don't go that far in the book, obviously. I just look kind of post-World War II. But I think when we talk about Black Islam, it's a very kind of damning critique of the U.S. nation state. It's a very damning critique when you think about what it emerges out of, right? And I think because of that critique it's offering, people don't want to talk about it. They'd rather, you know, like, shine a light on other kinds of Muslims. And I think there's that history. They want to erase the damning kind of critique that's made by Black Islam on kind of U.S. empire. But it's also the case that, like, the post 9/11 in particular, Islam is seen as this foreign thing, right? It's seen as this thing that comes with these foreigners. And there's a deep strain, obviously, in the U.S. of anti-immigrant bias. And so it taps into that. So then because Islam is foreign and here are these foreign people coming, then these people are the face of Islam. And of course, these people become the face of Islam, and they also then replicate the erasure of black Islam, right? There's a deep kind of antipathy or anti-blackness, if you will, amongst way too many immigrant communities, not just Muslim communities, but if we're talking about Muslim communities, in Muslim communities toward black people in general, but even black Muslims as well. So I feel like there's a couple things going on at the same time, but I just think that, like, as you said, Mishana, like, I mean, I don't think people really grasp how foundational Islam is to black radical, like just black art and black politics. I mean, we can do a name check and people might be surprised. But even beyond the name check, I mean, I think someone told me about a poll that came out like maybe a few months ago, and I could be wrong, so I don't want to be quoted on this, but I think it might have been a Pew poll about different communities in the United States and their fear of Muslims or Islam. And they had all these groups by different racial categories, like in the percentage of people who were afraid of Islam or expressed some sort of fear. And black people were by far the lowest. They had the least amount of fear toward Muslims, right? Again, because within black communities, it's more acceptable. They know about, even as basic as names as Rashid and Tariq, or, you know, they might have uncles and aunts who had converted, or they know families and friends who were, you know, and of course you can't ignore Malcolm X. I mean, Islam is so kind of woven into the fabric of black life that it's not seen as something foreign, right? So there's all these different kind of conversations we can have, and I'm sure we will over the next couple of sessions, but I think at the foundation, black Islam is too much of is too condemning a critique of the United States for people to kind of like shed light on it and give voice to it. And I think that was part of the reason why I wrote the book, was to kind of like shine light on the influence that Islam had on black art and politics, but not just black Muslim art and politics, even non-Muslim black art and politics, right? So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is great. Thank you so much, Sohail and Mishana, for hanging out on Ajam's YouTube page. Just let everyone else know in the audience, we're going to have a next one on Chapter 3, which Return to the Mecca, correct? That's the name of that one.
Right.
That's going to be on March 22nd at Sunday, noon Pacific, and 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And I just want to let you know, if you have any more questions, I know we had at least 15 more questions or so that we didn't have time to get to. I'm sure y'all in the audience do too. So we'll have a forum discussion. We'll be able to open it up throughout the week to just ask questions, any comments you have for us and how we're doing this. We'd love to hear. Like us on Twitter and Facebook. It's at AjamMC. For us, Sohail, you're Sohail Daulatzai, correct,
Yep.
on Twitter?
Yep.
Cool. Let us know what you think. We really want to hear it. This is all for you. So let us know what your thoughts are. And Facebook, again, Ajam Media Collective. Yeah, we'd love to hear from you, but have a good rest of the day. And this will be archived and put on Ajam's website for all to see for all eternity. So you can see what we look like for the rest of the time on Sunday, March 8th. But take care. And Sohail, again, thanks again.
Thank you.
We'll see you all in a couple weeks.
All right. Bye.